Has college football changed forever? This man sitting over here is going to help me break that down on a very, very special Iceman and UB. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the first ever Iceman and UB. And you're probably a little bit confused. Normally, there is a bearded man on the other side of the camera from me. Today, there is another man who you probably don't recognize, and you're wondering, why did I call it Iceman and UB? Well, this man sitting here is one of my favorite people in all the world. And you know him, if you're on Facebook, as Barry Adkins. But I know him very, very lovingly as Uncle Barry. And we are going to call him UB from here on out. So, UB, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking out the time. How you doing?
I'm doing fabulous. It's great to be on with the world-famous Iceman.
World-famous? I don't know if world-famous.
Yes. No. I've been watching you. I've been keeping up with you. And I'm for one thing, filling some very big shoes. The coach, and also, I believe my nephew, Mike Pasquino, has sat in the seat many times.
Mike has definitely sat in a seat sitting across from me. Mike has the gift of gab, as they would call it, and he's an interesting guy. However, you're interesting too, and I know you don't give yourself enough credit for that, but we're going to get into why you're actually sitting here. But I'm really happy that you're here. I hope that you enjoy this, and you don't really have big shoes to fill, because quite frankly, I only really have people on here that I feel like are worthy of the seat and who I feel like are going to give our listeners and our viewers a very good experience. So just let loose, my man.
All right. What do you want to talk about?
Well, first, I want to remind everybody that if you have an opinion or you want to tell us we're full of crap, you can call or text the show. 703-718-6314 is the number to do that. I'll repeat that again. Area code 703-718-6314. If you want to tell us how full of crap we are, it's definitely happened before. Don't let yourself be shy. So, Barry, one of the things that I like to do on this show, whenever there's a new face or there's a new voice, I like the person to have the opportunity to introduce themselves to the people that are across that camera. And I always like to do what's called bona fides. So I want you to start, first of all, talking about your love of sports, how you came about being a sports guy, and the family connection that you have. Because every single person who's into sports, it's almost guaranteed some type of a family connection.
Well, for me, Matt, it would go back to my childhood, of course, and my mom and dad. My father was a big sports fan. He was never an athlete. I certainly wasn't an athlete. I played sports on the playgrounds coming up as a kid in leagues, but never like a high school sports star or anything like that. But my dad and mom loved sports. We watched it all the time. As a little kid, I can remember my mom would let me stay up late and watch playoff baseball games, World Series games. My dad used to take me to, at the time when I was a kid, our high school basketball team, Middleton High School, was unbelievable. They went like 3 seasons undefeated and won multiple state titles. So we went to basketball games all the time. We went to Citadel football games all the time because we lived in Charleston. And we were also big South Carolina Gamecock fans. My dad sort of turned me on to the Gamecocks. I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing because it's been a rough following of the Gamecocks over the years. I also passed that curse along to both of my children. And I don't know if I say a curse because it at times it can be very, very difficult to be a Gamecock fan.
It's funny you mentioned the curse part of it because I grew up obviously a familial thing. My father passed down Boston sports. Today, most people, young people who don't know any better would know all winning and a lot of entitlement. You've probably listened to me rant about how I can't stand Boston sports fans. I'll say it again. I can't stand any of you. I am not your kind because they have forgotten what it's like to be in rough times, to be losers. And my father passed me the Red Sox curse that didn't get broken until 2004. So he passed me all those World Series that he was alive to watch them lose. And the Patriots weren't anything until Tom Brady came along. The Celtics hadn't won anything since the 80s, and the Bruins hadn't won anything since the 70s. So it's funny how sports can be both a blessing and a curse. Like, if you have been passed a great lineage, all those Patriots fans who were born since they started winning don't know any different. And it's funny about that. But the familial thing, and you talk baseball, I have a hypothesis that I want to run by you because I've heard this many, many times. Almost always, it seems like the gateway drug for sports is baseball. Do you think that's true?
I think so. I still think baseball's the great American pastime. It's a people talk about baseball. They say it's too slow. They've done things this year to speed up baseball with the pitch count, and batters where they time what's it a time that where batter calls timeout. If he's not ready to go, it's a strike. So they've done things to speed the game up. But I think there's something to be said about a baseball game, and if you keep a score on it, like a scorecard, and just the way it moves, and it's almost like an opera, kind of, in a way. And getting back to the Red Sox, how old were you when Buckner let that ball go through his legs? Do you remember that?
I was 3.
You were 3?
Yeah.
Okay, you don't remember that. Well, I got an interesting story about that Red Sox first World Series championship in a long, long time. And what year did you say that was again?
2004.
2004. I'm a big Jimmy Buffett fan. Jimmy Buffett had played a concert at Fenway Park that same year, and he called a witch doctor on stage to lift the curse. And I believe that would be the curse of the Bambino.
It is.
To lift the curse. And the Red Sox won the World Series that year.
They did. I'm not sure how much the witch doctor had something to do with it, but
I still think the witch doctor was all about it.
I think the witch doctor made it so that David Ortiz hit a couple of really clutch home runs and got some really clutch hits that year, and allowed Dave Roberts to steal second base on the great Mariano Rivera.
So when you talk about the Red Sox winning the World Series, you can't leave out Jimmy Buffett and the witch doctor.
All right, I'll make sure we do that. We're going to get into music a little bit later, so save that thought for a little bit later. But baseball is also uniquely tied to radio, which is kind of akin to what we're doing here, and it's my first love. It's the reason that I wanted to do this, because I used to listen to late night radio, sports radio specifically. Do you remember the great Jim Valvano?
Oh, of course. Athletic director and longtime basketball coach of the North Carolina State Wolfpack.
He had a brother, Bob Valvano, who was always a late night ESPN radio guy. Used to listen to him all the time.
Interesting thing he used to do, I'd listen to him many mornings going to work. I'd work early in the mornings, and he usually would come on the weekends, and he'd be talking about kind of a neat little niche he had. He would go through the Major League Baseball ballpark giveaways for the weekend.
That's awesome.
And what they were giving bobbleheads or T-shirts, and what was cool and what wasn't cool. And he was a neat guy and a guy that really loved sports. And I don't know, is he still on radio?
He may be on radio. I don't know. But that's where I kind of got my love for it. The spoken word was always kind of my thing. But you used to do some radio DJing, did you?
I did years ago. Another lifetime, a failed radio career. I was my jock name was Barry West on the Rock and Roll Fox, WFXR in Charleston, and enjoyed it. Didn't really take it seriously. Had stories I couldn't even recant to you here on this forum.
It's a family program.
Yes, it is, but had a great time. And that was back in the days when you actually spun records and everything wasn't computerized. And I was famous for not following. We had a playlist, and I was famous for just getting the playlist and throwing it aside and playing whatever the heck I wanted.
That tracks as to how you are today. You're a big music guy, so you are not stuck to one genre or one artist. You kind of forge your own path in music, so it makes sense that you would do that. But do you ever wish you could go back and, knowing what you know about today, how just about any Jane and John Doe can pick up a microphone and become a radio personality?
I do. I think that I could have been pretty good at it had I taken it seriously, and I didn't. But, it's sort of like the road not taken, that Frost poem. That's just the way it goes sometimes.
Or perhaps that road has converged to this moment right here in the space-time continuum, and you're able to do this. But you also did some broadcasting too, like of high school games, soccer games. Did you do that too?
Well, not really broadcasting. I was the PA guy for 4 years for West Ashley High School soccer. They tried to get me to do football, and they explained to me everything they wanted me to do, and by not paying me, it was too much. So I just stuck to soccer, and I loved it, and I used to ham it up, and I had a guy named Jack Klontz who worked up there with me, and I loved it because I could play music and could say doofy things, and no one cared because there were never a lot of people at soccer games.
Yeah, but it's an opportunity to do that. You remember Mike and I got to do that for Luke's baseball game or T-ball game. We got an opportunity to do that. It's fun, but I miss the days of broadcasters, right? I think today there's a few of those preeminent guys. I think of Al Michaels is kind of in that category. He's been doing it a long time, right? Knows how to do it professionally, but nowadays, you're not really looking for professional. You're looking for personality. You're looking for the Tony Romos who are going to predict plays, and it doesn't have to be polished anymore. Maybe this is me getting older, but I miss the old days of those guys, those voices you recognized.
Probably the greatest baseball broadcaster to me of all time was the great Vin Scully.
Yes.
Longtime voice of the Dodgers.
Rest in peace.
And he could paint a picture like no other. And, you know, I can remember you talked about baseball and listening. You talked about listening to Valvano on the radio. I can remember being a kid, and this was back in the 70s, and I had an AM radio. And I would lay in my bed at night with that AM radio and just scan the dial. On an AM radio, you could pick up stations all across the country. I could sit in my bedroom and scan that dial, and you wouldn't always pick them up. They'd come in for a while, and they'd go out.
Mm-hmm.
And I could listen to a baseball game at Kaminsky Park.
Yeah, baseball is the best sport for radio because you pick up the ambient sounds. And by the way, for anybody watching or listening, if you're hearing some ambient sounds, it's because we do have a live studio audience here, some family members who are kind of doing their own thing. So we kind of have that baseball vibe going on right now, which is what I kind of wanted.
We do. And another thing about baseball is, if you think about it, it's probably the great Deion Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
They asked him, they said, what's the most difficult thing that you ever did sports related? And he said, it's hitting a baseball. You think about it, you hit for 300, you're an all-star. You're a Hall of Famer if you're a lifetime 300 hitter, most times. If you perform 30% on your job, 30% success rate on what you do, you'd be fired.
Baseball and weather people are in that same category. They can be right about 30% of the time and be considered elite at what they do. That's a good point. But going back to broadcasting to segue to what I really want to talk to you about, if I say this catchphrase, do you know which broadcaster this is? Whoa, Nelly.
Keith Jackson.
Yes. One of my favorites. The other one I used to love was You Are Looking Live.
Jim Nance?
The great Brent Musburger.
Oh, Brent Musburger.
Yes.
Yes.
And both of those are synonymous with calling college football, at least in the last 30 years or so. The last game that Keith Jackson called was the greatest college football game of all time, arguably, which is Vince Young over the USC team running into the corner. And then he said nothing and let the moment speak for itself.
One of my favorite Keith Jackson quotes, and this is an obscure one, but he was talking about the Oklahoma State game. And he said, that's like going to church on Sunday. You don't know who's going to holler.
Exactly. He had catchphrases, but when that voice came on, you knew what it was. And to me, that is a sign of the old way college football is. And you're a big college football guy. You talked about the Gamecocks. Football sells. It's the collegiate sport that sells the most. And it's changed. It's fundamentally changed just in the last 2 years or so. But it's been kind of snowballing to this effect. And I really wanted to know for you, how does it make you feel just generally about where college football is today?
I'm glad that we have NIL. I think the athletes were getting shortchanged for years. And I like the fact that it is all out in the open now. You've had teams paying players for years. I'm going to get and I'll get more than one in tonight, my dig at the Clemson Tigers.
I was hoping you would.
Clemson, their first national championship, that national championship, I firmly believe was bought and paid for. And they're not the first ones to do it. Georgia's done it for years. Alabama's done it. Now at least it's all out in the open. There's no pretense that we're playing fair because you're not. And the kids are making some money. They deserve it. The genie's out the bottle. I mean, this thing went to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court, it was unanimous. So there's nowhere to go with it.
It feels like it's the natural progression of where this is going. And it's not just college football. It's a lot of different things. Money talks in everything that we do. Coach and I say that a lot, especially with this PGA stuff and this LIV stuff, the Saudis. Money talks at every point. But when it comes to collegiate sports, I always, and I'll cop to this, was on the boat of, well, they're getting an education. And I just didn't understand the nuances of it until I got older, until I knew student athletes who'd gone through what they went through, not even at big-time universities, even at just some like HBCUs, right? The dedication that they're making to their craft, and the school is making something off of them, and nothing is coming back in return because if they're not on the field, they're not valuable. And now take it to the highest level. Let me ask you a question. Nick Saban, I always see him as a CEO. He's not really a football coach. He only loves his players for what they can do for him on the field and for that program at large. And as soon as they are done, he's kind of done with them. Or if they're not performing, they're done with them. At least now, as you pointed out, they're getting something for it. Because if you get injured, which is a risk of the game, you're not hung out to dry. And I think that is a good thing. It's been difficult for people to, I think, embrace that thought process, though. Because for a long time, everybody's like, nope, they shouldn't get paid.
But one thing that the NIL has, and I think is going to ultimately do, you're not going to have these smaller schools, like let's say East Carolina. I'll just use them for an example. Central Florida is now a Power 5 school, but a school like maybe a South Florida that maybe could be good 1 year because they've developed some guys. When a guy is a freshman or sophomore and he's showing you anything at those schools, he's going to transfer. He's going to be offered some moolah, and he's going to go to one of these big schools.
But do you remember it? You had to take a year off. You lost a year of eligibility when you wanted to transfer. And not everybody wants to transfer for the same reasons. I think that generally speaking, we generally lump all of these ideals on individuals that are trying to do something. We'll say like, oh, see, they're just selfish. They don't want to do what they have to do. They don't want to wait it out for the team. When if you got recruited to Alabama, there's only so many people that can see the field. And if you can go to another school and you can hone your craft and actually get playing time, that matters. And they would have to lose eligibility. But as soon as the coaches wanted to leave for a bigger and better paycheck, they were there. Well, no questions asked.
You say Alabama, and we'll talk about another old story. I heard about the great Bobby Bowden, who's dead now, longtime coach of Florida State, West Virginia. He started, before he went to West Virginia, he was the coach of Samford College, which is in Birmingham. And he used to tell the stories in the early 70s when he was coaching at Samford, or it may even been the late 60s. Bear Bryant was at Alabama. And back in those days, there was no limit on scholarships. So Alabama could offer scholarships to gosh knows how many players, and they would just stack them up so other SEC schools and other schools couldn't get them, but they'd never see the light of day there. And he said it was like a cattle call. Every year he would go to Tuscaloosa, and Bear Bryant would say, here's what you could have any of these guys. I'll let them transfer to you at Samford, which was Division II. Was not Division II. At that time, it was Division I, 2A. Now I think what is it now? FCS
yes.
and FBS. And he could just great athletes that could have probably played for a lot of different schools, but Bear Bryant gobbled them all up, and they ended up playing for smaller schools.
I think the days of that are certainly over. Players have a little bit more power, but what comes with that is the amateurism is out the door. And it's funny because even the play on the field is still amateur sometimes when you watch it. Like if you watch NFL football and then you watch football on Saturdays, I'm not saying that they're bad football players, but it is still amateur because not every single guy that's out on all of those fields is going to make it to the NFL. It's still a very, very small crop of players that are going to make it out there. And one of the benefits of this whole thing for me is that players that aren't guaranteed to get that next paycheck, because let's face it, guys like Bryce Young, they don't really need NIL because they're going to make it to the NFL based off their talent alone. They're going to get that big payday and they'll be good. But not every player is like that. A lot of the players on a lot of these national championship teams, they're probably selling insurance now because they didn't make it pro. At least now they have something that they can carry with them for that career in insurance.
Well, I've got an interesting question I want to pose to you. Do you think, and people banner this around all the time, you talked about the difference between college and pro. And I think there's a chasm. There's a chasm between high school and college. There's a chasm between college and pro. Do you think that, what was the worst team in the NFL this year? Was the Texans?
Yes,
weren't they the worst
easily.
Team? Texans, Georgia. What happens in that game?
I do think, though, that the Texans still have a decided advantage because they're pros. And again, they've had, in some cases, a lot of veterans on that team experience. The biggest difference to me between the cream of the crop in college football and even the worst NFL team, a lot of it comes down to the way that they train. And you can ask a lot of trainers that too. You see how much stronger players get when they're in the NFL. So if you've got a team like the Texans who can't win more than 2 games, but if you take all of those guys, they were probably some of them the best players on their college team. And now you add that NFL experience. And the NFL game is faster. That's the other thing. The NFL game is so much faster than college. So these guys, especially these defensive guys, they would be bum rushing all those guys on Georgia so fast. Even though there's a lot of pro-level talent on Georgia, they've not been in the big time. And I believe experience matters more than anything. And the Texans would, I don't want to say they roll them, but if they played 10 times, the Texans would probably win 8 times.
I think they'd win 10, and I think they would roll them.
You do? You think
Yes.
it'd be that much of a wash?
I think that I think they'd win by 4 touchdowns.
You don't think Stetson Bennett could toss some over the top of the Texans defense?
No.
He's 30 years old. He's seen a lot. I'm just saying.
He could toss back some cold ones.
Yeah, he probably can. But I know everybody wants to see that, and they want something that looks like relegation for the Premier League. The financials of that and just how different the game is. It would never be able to happen.
No, but relegation is cool.
No, relegation is really cool. it's just impossible. Now, we should tell you that Coach interviewed some guys from Tallboy Radio. Shout out to them. They all live in the great UK, and they're big soccer fans or football fans. And he interviewed them and talked about relegation. And I think the biggest difference is the financial system of how things are set up and the competitive nature of it. I don't want to say that athletes in the Premier League are more competitive, but I think it matters more who you play for. And they're making a lot of money, but it matters. When you get relegated, everybody takes that personally. I don't think anybody in the Texans, I mean, yes, losing sucks, but I don't think they take that home with them.
No, and especially management, front office, because they're looking at the draft.
Oh, management doesn't care at all. If there is something that separates what we do here in the U.S. from just about every other country, it's what we do here in terms of management for sports is all for the bottom line, to make money at the end of the day. And I can't fault them for it because it's a business. But while these businessmen and women over in these other countries are also making money, they want to win. Like if you own a Premier League team, it's not so that you can go to 31 other people and say, hey, we're part of this really, really, really exclusive club. They want to win. You know why? Because if you're a Newcastle fan and Newcastle gets relegated, you are really pissed.
But the thing about it, when you look at the Premier League, really, it's almost only a few teams really are winning big. Crystal Palace kind of came out of nowhere a few years ago. But other than Crystal Palace, you've got just Man City, Man U, Arsenal, Liverpool. I mean, I'm a big Tottenham fan. Tottenham, they kind of sniff a little bit, but they never really have the money to make it happen.
But they care about being bad. And I think that's a big difference. Like, I say this about the Cleveland Browns and the Bengals until recently were in this category, that I think their owners are more in the business of making money than they are of winning games. You can say that about probably half of MLB teams. I can't be taken off of that hill because I just know that they want to make money. Like, for how long have the Pittsburgh Pirates been bad?
Well, they started out this year actually leading the division, but you're right. They've been pretty much bad for a while. They'll have a few years where they'll come up a little bit and do a few things, but
guess what happens? It gets too expensive and we got to cut costs. And I think that's where it comes down to. So to answer your larger point, I think that the worst pro team is still decidedly better than the national championship winner in college. But I will say this. The players that played in college when I was in college are not nearly as good as the players that are playing in an overall sense now. And I say this a lot. When you see these guys on television, I didn't go to college with anybody that looked like that. And that was only 20 years ago. So we have come a long way in nutrition, with fitness, and just, I think, genetics. Somewhere the genetic line has improved.
Just look at the size. The other day I was watching an old video of a college game from the early 80s. The linemen are like 265, 270. My gosh, look at Mike Webster. What was Mike Webster at his optimal playing days? I mean, he was not 260 pounds, maybe, something like that.
By today's standards, yes.
And now these guys are all, if you're not 300 pounds, you're not sniffing it.
And you're not only are you not 300 pounds, but you're running like, what, a 540 or something like that? Like, these guys are fast, too.
Fast as a cat.
Agile. And I think that has lent itself to today's paradigm in college football, too, because there's so many players to go around. So players are going to search for playing time. And I think that's where the NIL thing does make an impact. But you pointed out the other day offline that players can be bought now. And that does add a fascinating element to it, because you wonder how many players or big-time recruits are going somewhere because the money is good or because they genuinely want to be at that school and play football for the school. And, like, how quickly is it going to change for them? That part, if I were a coach, would worry me.
Did you see the video that Georgia put out this week? A recruiting video?
Only you would know this. I don't pay attention to this stuff outside of the season.
I'm sorry, I'm not. I don't have the guy's name. He's one of the recruiting coordinators.
Sure.
They just signed a commitment from a huge lineman. They put a video out. This is from the University of Georgia. It's a rap video, typical rap video by some. I'm not sure what the rap group is.
Sure.
A guy grabbing a gold suitcase, grabbing his crotch, walking off, and I mean. That's just pretty brazen from a university to put that out there. It's like, come here, sign with us. We got the money for you.
Yeah, and they do have the money. But I think there are a lot of schools out there that maybe have sneaky money that just haven't figured out how to mobilize it yet. And I don't know enough about the financials of these schools. Like, I don't know how much revenue they bring in outside of football, how much of that revenue is given to try to recruit players. I mean, Jimbo Fisher last year got a lot of crap, because he had the best recruiting class money could buy, but he couldn't coach them worth a crap, and they didn't do very well.
And that's true. All these schools now have collectives, and they're out there beating the bushes for money, and you have to have it now. If you don't, you're going to be left in the dust.
The boosters. Coach always talks about the boosters. He talks about how coaches get fired and hired based off of whatever the boosters want. And they have so much disposable income that they are willing to just say, look, here's $30 million, get rid of Scott Frost because he's terrible.
Remember this. Let's get back to A&M for a minute. You can talk about, well, they had a lot of talent. They didn't do anything with it, so maybe it doesn't matter if you have all the talent. Watch them this year. Bobby Petrino is their offensive coordinator now. And I'm not a Bobby Petrino fan. No. I'm a Falcon fan, and I can't stand Bobby Petrino. But he is a good offensive coach. And look out for A&M. I think they're going to be good.
They could, and it does sometimes take time. But I think that the idea that the best class that money can buy, there are still elements of coaching and team camaraderie and togetherness, right? Playing together. You just can't, in football, throw a bunch of guys out there and think that they're going to be good. The reason why Georgia's and Alabama's and all of those are consistently good is because they have consistent play from a lot of the same players, and they have a deep bench, obviously. But those guys are getting reps at other levels, too.
But see, I see that even more at play in college basketball. I think now with these one-and-doners, and I think, now, help me with this, you're more up on the news than me in sports. Isn't the NBA addressing that? Aren't they going to aren't they doing away with that? Aren't you going to be able to go straight to the NBA the next couple of years? It seems like they agreed on that or getting ready to agree on it in the contract.
I think so. I was always a proponent of that because I felt like the difference between playing high school and the NBA, that you could make that jump a little bit easier. I always thought it was kind of performative to send them to college. And what for, right? The universities are the ones that benefit from that. I don't think the player somehow gets the ability to be really, really good overnight by having a year in.
And look at what we've seen happen in the NCAA tournament since this one-and-done phenomenon's come into play. You've had smaller schools. This year it was Florida Atlantic. Mm-hmm. You had Butler a couple of years. You had VCU. You've had smaller schools that have teams that are, like you say, cohesive, been together for 3 or 4 years, older guys. I mean, you watch NCAA basketball now. It's every year it's a turnover. You have to just do your homework every year. You don't know who's playing. The really good teams, you don't know who's even on the team.
This year I had a moment where I was watching the tournament because Coach and I really watched it. We had a bracket that was done by the first day, which was perfect for this show too, by the way, because we don't know what we're talking about. But I realized that every time they highlighted a player in some of these games, it was, he transferred from here. He transferred from here. And I'm like, every star player on a lot of these schools has transferred from somewhere else. And this is a direct correlation to the way that things are. Conference realignment has been a big, big topic because the playoff in football is going to be changing, and all these schools are jockeying for position, and it's still not over yet. The SEC is going to be gaining some teams. The Big Ten is gaining some teams. Everything that we once knew, the SEC, the Southeastern Conference, it's just by name only. The Atlantic Coast Conference, same thing. Still by name only because they've got Syracuse and Boston College who have no business being in a Southern Conference.
But they're still technically on the Atlantic coast. Syracuse is not on the coast, but it's a coastal state.
They are, but my point is all of that geographic relationship stuff is out the window. But the conference realignment thing, Coach, the very first episode we ever did was we realigned college football. Each of us came in and picked 64 teams that we thought would be a part of what I have been hypothesizing is going to happen, a 4 super conference, 16-team conference league. And that league is going to break away from the NCAA and create almost like a semi-pro league. It feels like that's where we're headed.
I'll tell you where I think we're headed, a little different. I could see the 64, but I could see it almost being a 32-32, like an NFC, AFC, where you have 2 divisions battling it out, and you have something like a Super Bowl.
Really? That's an interesting one I hadn't thought about, is they take 32, break them into divisions, and kind of almost... It is a pro league at that point. But how do you separate that from the university? Because the one thing that gets lost in all of this is the academics. That's the whole reason, mostly, why you go to college. I mean, maybe I went to get drunk and get laid, but it wasn't necessarily what was happening for me. So I was getting good grades, right? So I was doing the one thing you're supposed to do. We also know that a lot of these student athletes don't go to school. Their major is football or basketball.
I think you said it perfectly. Education has been lost. Look at North Carolina in basketball. They got nothing on an investigation that just showed that kids were going to a class that didn't even exist. What did they do? They lawyered up, and they said, well, because other students were doing the same thing, we can't do anything to you. I don't think these big-time athletes at these schools are even going to class. If they're going to class, they're hokey-mokey subjects that and courses that don't amount to anything.
So shouldn't we be taking the next step to actually get rid of the sports and the athletes from the educational system and just make it what it is? It's a semi-pro league at this point. It seems to me that it's taking away spots for people who actually want to go to these universities to better themselves in another way besides sports.
We could make an argument for that, but it'll never fly, because then they just wouldn't be it would never fly. They couldn't go to college. They just couldn't do it because they're not going to class.
But they don't have to.
Well, that you're right, but there would be just such an outcry. I don't ever see that happening.
There would be until the right people got paid, and then all of a sudden nobody would care. That's how this country works now.
Well, here's an interesting. You're talking about getting paid. You see all these layoffs at ESPN. By the way, I am so happy Jeff Van Gundy is gone. That is way long overdue. God only hope he doesn't end up at TNT. I hope he just goes off to, I don't know, the Australian League and calls that. He's terrible. But this wave of layoffs. ESPN is hemorrhaging viewership. ESPN was down, I think, in the last few years from like 120 million viewers down to 74 million. And people are cutting the cord every day. So the question, the question I ask you and I ask everyone is, there's going to be a tipping point. ESPN can't keep paying more and more money to these conferences and these leagues because they're just losing the viewership.
The amount of money that ESPN had to pay for, I think it was the ACC network, might have been the Longhorn network. I can't remember the ones that they actually have. So if you're listening or watching,
the SEC network,
yep, is nothing to what they had to pay for some of these conferences or what they will have to pay for them coming up pretty soon. And you bring an interesting point up. Coach and I talked about this on a yet-to-be-released episode that we did last night about all of that, the layoffs, the hiring of Pat McAfee, guys like that who are going their own path and not starting the way that traditionally it has been done. And Coach's hypothesis is that people like this are the reason why viewership is going down because, as he put it, any Jane and John Doe, or what do you call it, Tom, Dick, and Harry could buy this equipment and start their own show. And granted, it's difficult to find reach. So obviously we don't have a large reach yet, but you can do it. It never used to be that way. And now I think ESPN is in the business of hiring personalities rather than professionals. Because I think you look at the people that they got rid of, it's a whole bunch of former athletes that people know. Keyshawn Johnson, right? Jeff Van Gundy even is a name that people of our relative age bracket could recognize.
When I think of Jeff Van Gundy, and I'm going to go back to Jeff Van Gundy and bashing him, I just think about that playoff game where he was holding the guy's leg.
Alonzo Mourning.
And just getting drug around the court. I'm glad to see. That's one good thing. I'm glad to see Jeff Van Gundy.
This is a tangent, but don't you miss rivalries like that?
I do. I think we still have some. I guess the greatest rivalries to me in professional sports, besides like the Yankees, Red Sox, and baseball, would be the NFC East. I think you still have some nasty rivalries in the NFC East.
But they're few and far between. And that's the sad thing is you used to care passionately about these things to the point where you just couldn't stand it. And the players couldn't stand each other. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird might be friends now. They could not stand each other back in the day. They were competitors. Michael Jordan hated everybody that wasn't on his team. Ultimate competitor.
He hated every Detroit Piston.
He hated himself, too, probably, because he was a notorious asshole. But that's what you need to be to win. You have to be a competitor. And I feel like that's also getting lost in college football, too. You can schedule some of these rivalries, but even Virginia Tech used to play West Virginia every year. I still hate West Virginia. But we don't play them anymore. Why? Like, we've lost that part of it. That's the fundamental thing. Like, I'm happy the players are getting paid. I'm happy anybody's getting paid. But as a viewer, I just want to watch some damn college football.
You're right. It's like we said, the genie's out of the bottle. Things are changing. They're fluid, and they're going to change more. And you talked about Virginia Tech. That's your alma mater. And the ACC is an interesting subject right now.
Well, it's the education part. because they are more focused in some regards, right? Virginia Tech is a very good engineering school. There's a lot of good schools that exist in the ACC for their education. People go there for something other than sports. And those schools, unless they have a really good program, like Clemson would be recruited somewhere because they've done a lot of winning in football, having nothing to do with what they bring to the table in an education fashion. You know what I mean?
But you know what I've heard? And I said about the ACC being an interesting subject now, you've got this group of 8 schools in the ACC. Virginia Tech's one of them. Clemson, Florida State.
NC State probably.
NC State, North Carolina. They're all saying, hey, we're trying, they've got the grant of rights. Remember now, the ACC, when Maryland pulled out and went to the Big Ten, the ACC athletic directors went to the conference commission. They said, my gosh, we have to do something. We don't want our teams leaving, schools leaving. So they came up with this grant of rights. So now the ACC schools are tied to this grant of rights. They can't get out of it. If you go to another conference, you have to give all your revenue back to the ACC. So they want a different way of divvying up the money. How's a school like Wake Forest going to feel?
I agree.
When they don't get an equal share of the pie?
That's why I think the ACC is trying to bolster the ranks and trying to be one of those 16-team conferences because they want to remain. And I think that it benefits them to do that. And one of the things I learned over the last year, I don't know if you know this or not, but geographic location of the schools within a conference matters because of the TV stuff that you talked about. You know how you talked about ESPN paying all this money for these networks? Well, when it comes down to your cable subscriber, they pay a different rate if that particular network is not in a state that's already included in that conference. So when you look at the schools that are being recruited for these conferences, the reason why, like, people would say, like, Clemson going to the SEC makes sense because they're in South Carolina. They don't need that because they already have a South Carolina footprint with the University of South Carolina. And that does matter. Why the SEC? They're like, why are the SEC going after Oklahoma and Texas? Because they're 2 new states that they didn't already have. So now they grab those states and that market in with the money that comes in from these revenue-generating networks and stuff like that. I did not know this. So that changes the way you look at the realignment when you realize, oh, these conferences need to go find states they don't already have.
Well, and the 2 schools that are the sexiest in the ACC for other conferences to try to get, from what I'm hearing, are North Carolina and Virginia, because they are in major markets. You've got that North Carolina market, Charlotte area, the Triangle. You've got that Tidelands where you live, up that D.C. area, Maryland area. Those are huge markets. Virginia Tech's in play there too. Virginia Tech, to me, is more of a fit for the SEC. Virginia's more of a fit for the Big Ten, and I think it has to do with academics.
Yeah, it does. And that's the other thing is these conferences, if they're going to pick schools that aren't great at a sport like football or basketball, they're going to try to bolster the academic ranks so that they can say, look at how great our conference is academically. And that's where all of this makes me laugh, because it's a dog and pony show. It's all for show. They don't actually care about academics. They don't care about education. They just want to be able to say, look at our graduation rates within the conference, when really what they're doing behind you is counting all the money coming in from all of these ad deals and all the bowls and all that crap that comes along with it. And I know I sound frustrated, and I get why all this happens, but I had a come to Jesus moment about this where I'm like, oh, it's just all capitalism. That's all it is. And I used to not feel that way.
I think where we're headed with ESPN in particular, which drives everything now, let's be honest, with sports, it drives so much, especially college sports. We talked about them hemorrhaging viewers. I really believe, Matt, that ESPN, coming in the next maybe 10 years, and I know it's really not free TV now because you have to have a cable subscription. I think you're going to have all these, or just about every sport, you're going to have some sort of stream. You have to pay for a streaming service. I think that's coming.
I mean, it's already here. I mean, I'm cool, by the way. Anybody who wants to start a streaming service and have Iceman and Coach as a part of that streaming service, I'll take the revenue bump for sure. You're not wrong about that. A la carte television is on the way. And I think if you want to watch the Gamecocks and you live out of state, you're going to have to pay for a Gamecocks-only subscription or something like that.
You may have to pay in-state.
Yeah, you might have to, too. I mean, that's going on with baseball and blackouts and all that stuff, right? Those things are happening all the time. If you're trying to watch the Washington Nationals in Washington, a lot of times you can't find them because they're locally blacked out, even if you have, like, MLB TV, it's asinine.
Yes. Now, I've got a little interest. And I was thinking about this today when, I knew I was going to be doing this show with you. Do you know that Virginia Tech and South Carolina were in the same conference when I went to school at South Carolina?
I don't recall that, but I also know that Virginia Tech they've moved around a few times before they got to the Big East. I think was it like the old Southern Conference? I can't remember.
It was it wasn't for football. Now, they were both independents in football, but it was the old Metro Conference.
Okay.
And do you know who the other members of the Metro Conference were?
I do not.
Well, we'll start at the bottom and go to the top. You had Tulane and Southern Mississippi. You had Memphis. You had Florida State, Louisville, Cincinnati. It really was a pretty decent conference for a lot of sports. Back in those days, the great Denny Crum was at Louisville, and but it wasn't a football conference. It was all other sports but football, the Metro Conference. So, it's just kind of interesting to me how then everything just sort of football drove everything and everything changed.
Football is the king right now, but I want to ask you something because Virginia Tech, to me, I have come to grips with the fact that we are a mediocre program. Long gone are the days when I was there where Frank Beamer was at his heyday. I got to school there right after Michael Vick had left, and we were still in the national spotlight. We were a top 10 team just about every single year that I was in school. And it wasn't until right after I got out of college, we became mediocre, and we're never going to get back to that. And I feel like, and don't take this personally, but I feel like South Carolina is in the same boat. South Carolina is 100% that school that it's going to be difficult for them to get back to national prominence. Do you agree with that?
Well, South Carolina's never really been in national prominence in football. They had, when I was at school there, we had what we call our Black Magic season. Joe Morrison was our coach, a longtime Giant great, played with Frank Gifford. And I don't know if you know Frank Gifford back in the day of the Giants.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And South Carolina was up to number 2 in the nation. They'd smashed Florida State. Keith Jackson called the game on national TV in Columbia. Then they went to Navy and got the hell beat out of them. And they just have never recovered from that. Under Spurrier, they had 1 year where we finished number 4, and we had a top 10 recruiting class going, and the Spurrier was 69, and Steve Spurrier said, well, I'll only coach a couple more years, and the recruiting class fell apart. And then we hired Will Muschamp, and everything went to hell.
Wait, Muschamp was right after that?
Will Muschamp was right after Steve Spurrier.
I didn't know that it was that close in the timeline. For some reason, Will Muschamp feels like he's only been coaching for a handful of years now.
No, Will Muschamp has made a load of money losing places as a head coach. He got lost at Florida, had a big buyout. Lost at South Carolina, paid him $14 million.
He's rich.
He is rich.
He got paid. That's one thing about college that's interesting is you can be a failed football coach and be really, really rich.
And he's got 2 more national championship rings.
Yeah, he does. I mean, he's got more than we do at Virginia Tech, but you have a Virginia Tech connection because Shane Beamer, son of Frank Beamer, is now your coach. And I remember, Barry, one of the best things about you is in the middle of college football season, I can tell when you've been tipping back some of the old whiskey during a
bourbon.
Yeah, okay, bourbon during a South Carolina game because you had a lot of not nice things to say about Shane Beamer until the end of the season when things kind of came around. How do you feel about the Beamer era so far?
I wasn't for the hire. I thought they hired cheap. He had no experience. He was never he was a special teams coordinator. That was it. Never a head coach. Never really seriously considered by anyone for head coaching position. But he came in that first year, and we made a bowl, and we won a bowl. We ended up 7-6. I was really down last year when we went to Gainesville and just got curb stomped. And the next week we came out and beat the living hell out of Tennessee and knocked them out of the playoff. And then we went to Clemson, 31-30, beat Clemson, 31-30, knocked them out of the playoff. Lost the Gator Bowl to Notre Dame, but remember, we had 9 defense. Notre Dame had players out as well. And that's another thing we could talk about, how everyone opts out of these bowls now. If you're not in the playoff, the players opt out. I don't blame them. But we were down 9 starting defensive players in that game and still lost by a touchdown and had a chance to win. So I think, am I sold on Shane Beamer? No. But I think he's a really nice guy, and he's really positivistic, if that's even a word. And I think the future could be bright. But let's see. Remember, right now everyone's high. We play in the SEC, baby. All it takes is a 4-8 year, and everyone's ready to run him out of town again.
But here's the thing about that. Frank Beamer is the last of his kind because he was given the leash to be able to lose. And it wasn't until like year 6 or 7 where he got to his first bowl game. And why does that not happen today? I understand that money is so much more tied to the success and all of that. But Shane Beamer could build a program if given the time, but yet we're not patient enough to give these guys his time. So, like, how can you expect there to be overnight success at a school like Carolina or Virginia Tech when you just don't have the resources?
I think a guy like Shane Beamer might be the key. A guy that just is that enthusiastic. He seems to really you've got to win at a place like South Carolina or even Virginia Tech. You've got to catch lightning in a bottle. You got to get lucky with some recruits. You got to recruit your butt off with other recruits, and you've got to be a people person. I know that's an easy thing to people throw that around. I'm a people person. But you just have to have something about you that can go out there and maybe you can talk someone into, you're not going to be able to pay them as much money as maybe Texas A&M can, but you got to build that connection with them or their family where they like you enough, where they're going to take a chance and come there.
But that's an old school mentality. Like Bobby Bowden, you mentioned him earlier, and I said he was one of those coaches that was still trying to make boys into men who, when he walked into the living room of a recruit and talked to the family, in some cases a single mom, he was convincing them that I'm going to take care of your son. They're going to be in a better place when they come play for me. That's the way recruiting used to be done. There's no way that guys like Nick Saban do that. Urban Meyer didn't do that. They're not trying to convince them of anything, right? I see them more as a CEO, but I'm talking about these schools that are smaller. Like, you're right, Shane Beamer, Brent Pry, they have to go convince you that they're good people, that your kids are going to be in good hands with them at this university, because we can't promise instant success. We can't say that 50% of our players go to the NFL. It's just not something we can promise.
Now, are you happy with the Virginia Tech coach?
I'll be honest with you. I don't really know enough to say anything. I know that what he was handed was a crappy situation, and it's just the way that things are.
But Fuentes was a hot hire.
He was a hot hire who started out hot, and some things happened when you look at the way that went down. I don't know if you remember the quarterback they had the first year he was there. I think it was Gerard Williams.
Yes.
Or Gerard, I can't remember what his last name was. Forgive me. But he was there for 1 year, really good junior college guy, and they had a great season. They lost to Tennessee at the Battle of Bristol, which they've been talking about that game when I was there at school, and they finally got it. And I think he won 10 or 11 games that year. And then the quarterback leaves to go to the NFL when he's not even on anybody's radar. To me, I was like, well, that's odd, because why wouldn't he stay?
But wasn't that so cool to play football at that racetrack?
It was. I actually had tickets to go to the game, but ended up not going. We watched it on TV, but it was really, really awesome to see that. And that was, again, when Virginia Tech was still relevant. What you want to know what pains me, if we're going to get personal, is they make a big deal about Virginia Tech's entrance, which obviously I love personally. But
it's outstanding.
But what sucks is that it doesn't mean anything anymore because the team doesn't have any teeth. It used to mean something when you went to that stadium and Enter Sandman happened, and you knew that team was going to come out guns blazing. You knew that it was going to be the best Virginia Tech performance that you could have. And now you go out there and they're down by 14 at the end of the first quarter. Enter Sandman means nothing. It scares nobody.
It may scare. I still think it means something. I'm a big Gamecock fan. The Gamecocks under Lou Holtz the first season, we were 0-11. And yet that stadium was sold out for almost every game, and everyone was on their feet. We played some teams tough. We got steamrolled by some teams. I'll never forget the year after we went 8-4. Our first game of the year was against New Mexico State. South Carolina beat New Mexico State and tore down the goalposts. Beat New Mexico State and tore down the goalposts.
That's where we are, though. That's where our schools can be. And I don't know. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I love it. Every time I see it, I get emotional. I get choked up because I did that for so many years, and it meant something back then. And maybe that's what it is. You get sent back to a long gone time. But I don't know. Whenever they show it, it's cool that it's on there. I just wish the team performed better.
This is coming off a 3-8 year, or 3-9, 3-8, whatever it was. It was a bad year, terrible year. If Virginia Tech wins 8 games this year, your whole mentality will change.
Maybe. I love the school regardless, so it's not going to change anything with that. But when you look at the landscape, it's a sobering thought to realize that we're never going to be where we once were. Maybe we will one day, and I'll be able to say to my kid, I remember when Mike Vick played, or when his brother played, or Tyrod Taylor, one of my favorite Virginia Tech players of all time, Tyrod Taylor.
And who'd y'all lose to in that national? Wasn't it? Was it Florida State?
It was Peter Warwick in Florida State.
In the Sugar Bowl.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was actually the game that got me into college football. And it's the game that put Virginia Tech on the map for me as to where I could go to college.
When I was a kid, South Carolina, actually when I was in my 20s, South Carolina played Virginia Tech always, every year in football. And my dad, I can remember in the 70s, they used to always call Virginia Tech VPI.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they always called them. And an interesting thing about Lane Stadium, it was known to have high grass, and the field has I don't know what you call it, a pitch. You could stand, they say, at one time at Lane Stadium on one sideline, and you could only see a guy across from you at the 50 from the waistline up. Had a crown on the field.
Yeah. I mean, it was a special place. I've never brought my wife there, and I want to one day because Blacksburg is a very special place to me. But we're bumping up to the end of the hour, and I told you at the beginning that I like to do something fun with all of my guests. So, Barry, you're a music guy. I mentioned that earlier today. And we're going to do something called UB's Music Minute. I like to give my guests, even if they're not recurring guests, the ability to talk about something that they love.
Well, I hope I will be a recurring guest.
Oh, you will be anytime you want to. You've already earned that right. So I want you to talk about Barry's top 5 influential artists of his lifetime.
Top 5, that's easy for me. This is no particular order. I talked about him earlier, Jimmy Buffett. I love him. One of the greatest songwriters of all time. He's in the Songwriting Hall of Fame. Everyone just thinks Jimmy Buffett. They go, Margaritaville. Dig into it. There's a lot of stuff out there. He's a great songwriter, great entertainer, a legend. Should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Still don't understand why he's not and who gets in there. The Eagles. Grew up with the Eagles. Love the Eagles. Love them so much. Just outstanding. ZZ Top, that little old band from Texas. Still getting it, even though Dusty Hill's gone. They're still getting it. They're great. The iconic and great Led Zeppelin. Just outstanding. Enough said, really, when you say that name, Led Zeppelin. And the great Eric Clapton. Love him dearly.
Yeah, all 5 of those I grew up listening to because of my parents. But you mentioned the Eagles. The Eagles have somewhat of an emotional attachment for me. My mom, rest in peace, she passed away a couple years ago. Big Eagles fan. And I remember when she did her cross-country trip, she was kind of in a little bit of a crisis in her life. But she sent me a picture, and she was standing at a corner in Winslow, Arizona. And it was
such a fine sight to see.
Yes. And she made that joke, right? She made the reference, but I just remember, I still can vividly kind of see that in my mind. And this was before we had cell phone, like real cell phones. She was taking it with a flip phone, and I didn't even know what it was. And when she told me, it was like, she has been wanting to do that her whole life. And so I like to ask about influential musicians because I think people will say like my favorite, but your favorite doesn't necessarily mean it influenced you. Like there are artists that I listened to when I was younger who I don't necessarily listen to the way I did back then, but they influenced me.
A couple of more things on music before you have to wrap this up. I really couldn't do it justice when you just said 5. There's a 6th that has to be thrown in there. It's the mighty prophet himself, the great Bob Marley. You've got to put him in there. There's a Bob Marley movie coming out in 2024, a biopic, and I can't wait for it. He is one of a kind. But really quickly, people say constantly to me, old guys like me, there's no good music made anymore. They just don't make it. And I told, and the bands that I really talked about are old bands. But every year, I started probably in the last 5 years, I make a playlist off of Spotify. And I don't listen to all music that comes out, but I try to listen to artists that I know or that someone's turned me on to. And I make and it ends up being a massive playlist. Good music comes out every year. I just want to throw this out to the listeners and throw it out to you. I worked my way through the month of April. I'm into May now. The next album I'm going to listen to is Ed Sheeran's new album. And I know you're a big Ed Sheeran fan. But the 2 albums I've listened to that have stuck out to me, and one of them very well may be the album of the year for me. I have a top 15 albums at the end of every year, is the great Joe Bonamassa, Tales of Time. Great album. He's a great guitar player, one of the best living guitar players. And this guy's been around forever. Smokey Robinson. He has a new album called Gasms. If you're into old stuff like Teddy Pendergrass and Luther Vandross, he channels all that. There's not a bad song on that album, the great Smokey Robinson.
It's like you knew that I was going to ask you what kind of music you're listening to in 2023, and so you brought with you a playlist. You knew this is why you're going to be back on here. We are simpatico, my man. We're on the same wavelength, but I'm glad that you shared all of that because it's what makes you unique, and it's one of the things you share music with me every single day. And you told me at the beginning you may not listen to it. Hell, you might not even listen to it ever.
You may not like it.
But you said I'm going to share it with you anyway, and it's the way we stay connected, and I do appreciate that about you, and I'm glad that you shared that with the listeners. But I do have one more thing for you. Iceman Stat of the Week, something that we do every single week, UB. Normally, we do Iceman Stat of the Week, and Coach will make a pick of the week. But since he is not here and you had your music minute, I want to share with you a Stat of the Week. And I will let you know the coach sent me this personally because he knew that you were going to be here. He wanted to make sure you had the full experience here. So you're familiar with LSU?
Oh, yes.
So LSU has hired some new coaches over the last few years, and some of them have been successful. This pains Coach to send this to me because you'll get it why. He's a Notre Dame guy. So LSU hired Kim Mulkey, and in year 2, she won the national title. Obviously, they won the national title this year. Jay Johnson is in year 2, and they won the national title. Do you know the other coach at LSU who is in year 2?
That would be Mr. Brian Kelly.
Yes, and you know what that means. LSU for the national championship this year, my man. They're going to make it 3 this year, and it's going to make Coach so very angry.
SEC, baby.
That is a great way to put it, my man. Well, you know what? We are here at the end. We are bumped up to the hour. It has been a lot of fun, but I want to remind a lot of other people. First of all, if you have any opinions or you want to get in touch with this man, 703-718-6314 is the number to do that. Do not forget to support the Pub Time Podcast, which is where you can find the coach and my friend Ryan. They do some other stuff there that's a little bit more risque than some of the stuff we do here. So he's a chameleon, as he likes to tell me. He can kind of get on anywhere. Do not forget, if you want to find us on Twitter, Threads, or on Instagram, at Iceman and Coach is the handle to do that. You can find us on Facebook, INC Sports. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It is not mandatory, but it is helpful. If you're listening on Apple and Spotify, don't forget to hit follow, rate, give us some stars. I don't even care if it's 1. The more you do that, the more we actually start to grow and to chart. And do not forget to support the Matty S Media Network, mattysmedia.com, where you can find not only this show, but my Fire Footwear podcast, Political Football, and the Manual Cleve Wason. UB, it has been fantastic to have you here. Do you have any parting thoughts for the listeners?
I've got one thing I have to say. I've got to get a shout out to my Atlanta Braves. I've got to give you this real quick. 27-game stretch in June. The Braves batted over 300 as a team, averaged 2.5 homers, 7 runs per game, team slugging percentage .577. Let's just put that staggering number into perspective. Only 3 individual players have posted a higher slugging percentage during the season. The 2 MVP frontrunners, Shohei Ohtani and Ronald Acuna Jr., and White Sox All-Star Luis Robert Jr. The Braves are on fire, baby.
The Braves are going to be a favorite to win the World Series. Barry, thank you for preparing. Thank you for coming here. Everybody, I hope this finds you well. I hope this finds you safe. And from me and UB, this is Iceman and UB.